Well, tomorrow evening is the premiere of a brand new season of the TV series Cosmos. It was originally created by Carl Sagan and is now being carried on by his wife, Ann Druyan, and this time around narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson. We talked about him last week a little bit. Watching the original series for the very first time back in 1980 was a revelation for me. I thought the show was like church for the non-religious, and that was me back then, still is. Just a few years before that, I had left the Catholic Church, and I wanted nothing to do with religion in general because, at least at that time, all religions required a person to believe in certain things with either insufficient or no evidence, or to believe in things that were simply unbelievable in light of the scientific evidence that we were uncovering every day. So Cosmos, I called it Science Church. Science Church, because from start to finish it had this sense of awe and respect, this deep respect for life and the universe, so much so that the word sacred seemed to be an appropriate way to describe it at the time. Now, you might remember back in 1980, the greatest existential threat we faced was nuclear war. Right? Remember what they called it? Mutually assured destruction. And there was an acronym for it, MAD, MAD, perfect, right? Sheer madness, the idea that we were perhaps willing to snuff out the results of billions of years of design work carried out by natural selection in the blink of an eye just because of our petty human disputes and our arrogant ideologies. It should have been unthinkable, but we were thinking about it. Not only were we thinking about it, we were actively preparing for it. Shelters, duck and cover, all that kind of stuff. Now, we're not out of the woods yet, but the risk of that has, I think, been greatly reduced, thanks in part, I'd like to think, to shows like Cosmos. Because of those kind of programs, we are developing a different mindset, a different relationship with life and the universe, maybe a bit more awe and respect, and perhaps less arrogance and hubris, the kind of things that drive that quest for mad, mutually assured destruction. So last week we talked about the purpose of the universe. How and why did it all happen? And those are really the questions that are at the root of all science and theology and philosophy. You know, as soon as human beings developed language, we started telling stories that try to answer those questions. We still do tell stories, but our stories, of course, for the most part, change and evolve. And yet we don't throw out the old ones. We just look at them in a different way. We refer to them as myths. Doesn't mean that they don't carry some form of truth, at least what was true at the time, but that's the status they achieve. We've gone from the Garden of Eden, two people in the Garden of Eden and a talking snake, we've gone from that to the Big Bang. We've gone from thinking that thunder and lightning were angry gods making noise and hurling lightning bolts. We've gone from that to understanding electromagnetism. We've gone from thinking that the sun was a ball of fire that was carried in a chariot in the sky, across the sky every day. We've gone from that to understanding nuclear fusion, gravity, orbital mechanics. We've gone from thinking that people were possessed by demons to understanding the physical causes of mental illness. When it comes to these stories about creation, we can see some huge changes over the ages. You know, every culture on earth has an origin story or a creation story. There are hundreds of them. We covered a few in our Frontiers of Consciousness class, but up here we have depictions of just a few. We go across there to the Chinese story, the Greek stories, Hindu stories. Let's see, that's the Mayan story there. You have the Iroquois story, bottom in the middle, and then of course over there, the one that we're almost familiar with, the Hebrew creation story in the book of Genesis. And people in this country act as if Genesis is the only creation story in the whole wide world. It's just one of many. And it has a few features that make it unique and special in some good ways. Consider first the old creation stories from Babylon, ancient Babylon. Those ones are older than the book of Genesis. And the Hebrew people would have most likely learned about these Babylonian creation stories after they were conquered by the Babylonians and hauled off in exile. They lived there for around 60 years, so they probably picked up on this stuff. They would have known about them. And the thing about the creation stories from ancient Babylon, they are incredibly violent. Trust me when I say that you don't want to hear the actual story here this morning, but I'll give you the gist of it in about one line. Okay, there's a goddess named Tiamat who is murdered and split in two by the storm god Marduk to form the heavens and the earth. The book that it comes from, it's called the Enuma Elish, and tells the story in just nauseating, gory detail. It's pretty bad. I'm surprised that Sam Peckinpah or Quentin Tarantino has made a movie out of it yet. But now compare that creation story to what we get in the book of Genesis. You know, it's almost like the Hebrew people came back from Babylon and said, no thanks, that slain goddess gory stuff don't work for us. So in their story, God calls forth creation from the void. It is somethingness out of nothingness. There's no violence, there's no chaos, just the void out of which the creation is called. And what's in it for the Creator in Genesis? Why does the Creator create according to the book of Genesis? Well, the only thing that the story tells us is this. There's this simple 7-word phrase that gets repeated over and over each day of the creation story. And the phrase is this: and God saw that it was good. It was good. No violence, no blood, no gore. I mean, here the Creator creates because the Creator wants to bring forth something that is good, true, and beautiful. It's that simple. Of course, unfortunately, there's plenty of ultra-violence and bloodshed and genocide to come later in the Bible, but it sure got off to a good start, didn't it? And we need to give credit where it's due. This was a more evolved and enlightened view of how things got going. It really was. The Hebrew creation story says this universe is meant to be orderly and good. All right, so fast forward with me now from Genesis all the way to the Gospel of John, opposite ends of the Bible. And this is how John retells the creation story. The Gospel of John doesn't have a Christmas story. It just has this creation story, and you're pretty familiar with it. It's the one that says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. 3 things: the Word, life, and light. Life and light, self-explanatory. They're good things. But what does he mean by word? And we've talked about this before, but just a brief review here this morning. The Greek word for word, remember, is logos. This is the definition of logos, straight from a Greek dictionary. Logos, something said, including the thought. By implication, a topic or a subject of discourse. Also, reasoning, the mental faculty or motive, the reason behind it, or reasoning. Both of those. So, John isn't saying John is saying that the universe isn't just good, it's based on ideas and reason. Yet another step, I think, this is another evolutionary step in the creation story. I mean, this is a pre-scientific world. Certainly Genesis and the time of John were both pre-scientific, a pre-scientific world with a pre-scientific worldview, but somehow the author of John captures this truth that science is still working with today, trying to identify those rules, the reasoning, the underlying principles that make the universe what it is, and which in turn, of course, makes us what and who we are. I would suggest, that slide I showed with all of the different creation stories on there, I think we should put Cosmos right up there on that slide along with the creation stories of the world, and we could call it the modern scientific creation story. It's always changing, we're learning new things, but it is based on certain core principles that so far seem to be holding up pretty well. Nobody claims to have all the answers. Nobody claims to have all the answers, but that doesn't mean it's okay to insert supernatural explanations wherever there's a gap in our knowledge. A good scientist isn't afraid to say, I don't know, and then just let it be for the time, instead of jumping to insert some supernatural explanation for it. But there's plenty that we do know, and we learn more each day. Some people, they talk about what they call an information explosion. It's like every day there's more and more, every year there's more and more. It's a steep curve that's approaching the point where it's going straight up. We are figuring out what the Logos is made of, and we can call them rules, laws, principles. That's the one that I like because it comes from the early history of the Unity movement. Early on, you can see how Unity acknowledged this process. Back in 1890, there was a book we talk about every now and then called Lessons in Truth by Emily Cady, 1890. And I'm paraphrasing her here. What she said is that God is the name that we give to that unchangeable, inexorable principle at the source of all existence. That's pretty much word for word, actually, not so much a paraphrase, but God is a name that we use for something else, principle. So, based on that, maybe we might try updating our creation stories from Genesis and John. And if we do that, here's how that might sound. In the beginning, when the conditions were just right, the principles of physics said, time for some light. The Big Bang, as we like to call it, and the light proceeded according to the sacred formula of E equals mc squared. It works. So, it did that so the energy would coalesce and form the elements, which formed the stars, from which solid matter, the building blocks of the planets and life itself, would be forged according to the four sacred forces called the strong nuclear, the weak nuclear, gravitation, and electromagnetism. It's all principle at work. The same principle was responsible for the evolution of biological life by natural selection, humanoid life, which finally achieved this thing that we all experience together, this self-reflective form of consciousness that, as far as we know, is unique to humans. After that, human survival depended on us learning how to get along. So, consciousness, which is really toward the very end of this long, billions of years long process, consciousness leads to empathy, compassion, and altruism. And that's the reason why we can look around the world, and despite all the bad stuff that we hear, we can truly look around and say, it's amazing that it all works as well as it really does, right? It really does. That's principle still at work. And all of that seems to, I think, quite naturally lead into something that Carl Sagan once said in the original Cosmos series. This is his observation. He said, we are the local embodiment of a cosmos grown to self-awareness. We have begun to contemplate our origins, star stuff pondering the stars, organized assemblages of 10 billion atoms considering the evolution of atoms, tracing the long journey by which, here at least, consciousness arose. So, Maybe those opening chapters of Genesis and John are a poet's way of trying to capture something that was beyond their knowledge at the time. And now that we know more, we can still enjoy the poetry for what it is. Here's something else that Carl Sagan said on the subject. This is from his essay called The Pale Blue Dot, which I highly recommend. He said, "A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge." Now, I've always entertained a fantasy that unity might emerge as that vision. We certainly have a minimum of ideological baggage to hold us back, so who knows what the future may bring. Like we were talking about last week, I prefer to see the possibilities. And the fact is that the story isn't finished yet. And that's why the new season of Cosmos, incidentally, is called Possible Worlds. Possible worlds. Not just possible worlds out there as inhabitable planets that we might reach in the distant future if we trash this one. That's one of the things that people look at. But also, it's going to be looking at possible worlds that are around us right now. Perhaps even right under our feet. For example, this is from last July. Scientific American magazine, celebrating its 175th year, says the mycelium revolution is upon us. Mycelium, it's the fungus mushrooms are made of. But it can also produce everything from plastics to plant-based meat to a scaffolding for growing organs and much more. It can also create its own communication network, which is something that they're going to explore on the new Cosmos. So, it's an exciting prospect. Again, it's tomorrow evening. What does it say here? 7 Central Time on Nat Geo. It's an exciting prospect, and I'm going to close today with one final short quote from Carl Sagan, who said this. He said, "Somewhere, something incredible is waiting to be known." See you next week. Thank you.